Dr. Jeff Bonar is a computer scientist by trade. He worked as one for decades. He led big software projects, but then his kids grew up, they moved out of the house and went on to live their lives. However, they returned and gave him a challenge. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and welcome to the American Farmland Owner Podcast. That challenge is how he eventually found himself as the CEO of CapCO2 Solutions. His focus is green methanol, and he thinks that it could be an alternative for producers and investors who want to not only reduce carbon emissions, but also find a new revenue source. We'll get to that part of this a little bit later, but we begin our conversation with him on that challenge from the kids to their dad. I'd like to start with this, that I heard an interview you did, and you talked about why you are doing what you're doing, essentially because your kids challenged you. How did that play out?
Yeah, so I had wrapped up my previous business activity. I was looking for what's next, and we were having a family get together. These are adult kids not living in the house. And I said, what do you think I should do? And they said, you need to do something about the climate. You screwed it up. You need to fix it.
Not you personally, of course, your generation, they mean, right?
Exactly. But they know how to make it specific and focused. So,
of course.
And they did it with a smile on their face. But that sounded reasonable. Like, okay, that's a good idea. And let me investigate and get into it.
So how did your previous career transition into this and translate into it?
Very good. So I'm a computer scientist by training, and I spent most of my career building very large software projects. And as you might imagine, in a large software project, it's not about the technology per se, though you do need good technologists. It's about getting people to agree. You know, does the customer want what the programmer wants to write? Does the business department of the company, are they okay with the features that are going to be there and how we're going to charge for them? And so you have to get people to talk a lot. And in particular, the technical people and the customers talking. And I was really good at that. That became my forte. And it turns out that's perfect for anything climate related, because it's just lots and lots of people having to rethink what they're doing it in a way that, makes sense from a business, real world perspective, but also something that really does impact, the carbon emissions. So it's been a very nice transition. I felt really great doing this work with, slightly different technical end products.
But there are a variety of ways that a person could choose to tackle climate challenges, right? But you've decided that green methanol is the way to go. Why that? How did you get interested in that, intrigued by it?
Sure. Yeah, so I initially explored software options.
Okay.
And like carbon accounting for a farmer, for example. And the problem is it's just too new. And it's like, well, what exactly are we going to have farmers do and why? And, how are there agreements on how to account for it? And that was all new stuff. And I was looking for a place where I could have an immediate impact and sort of be part of the transition instead of waiting for a mature world where the transition has already mostly happened. So I got excited about the opportunity of using bio-CO2, biogenic CO2 from like fermentation or manure treatment. And I'll explain why bio-CO2 is so interesting. And then I discovered that ethanol plants are the mother lode of biogenic CO2. It's like the biggest, you can get more of it in really clean form. And right now they're just throwing it away. So it just seemed, okay, that's the place to start a business rather than something that requires a mature, sort of thought through world. Um, I want to find something that's a starting point. And biogenic CO2, just to go back and explain that, um, CO2 plants capture CO2 all the time. That's how they live and grow. And if that CO2 gets released when the plant, decomposes, or when it gets fermented in the case of a ethanol plant, or when it gets eaten and then digested in the case of a manure treatment plant, that CO2 going back in the atmosphere, you can count it as net zero because it just was pulled out of the atmosphere. So within the last year, whereas fossil CO2 from oil or gas, that was pulled out of the atmosphere a million years ago, more or less, and you can't count that as net zero. So biogenic CO2 is this really interesting material that has lots of potential purposes for low carbon products. So that's where I focus. And then ethanol plants are, like I said, the mother lode of biogenic CO2.
Okay, let's see if I can follow you here. If we're going to deep dive this, this is where I might get lost, but I'm going to do my best here. Only one of us has a doctor before his name. I wussed out and dropped out after masters, so I'm not qualified on your level. But the process itself, let's zero in on ethanol because we've heard about we know what the
Sure.
present situation is. And we can talk about carbon pipelines later on, but that would be another way to kind of grab the pipeline, grab the emissions, tunnel them underneath in a pipeline, and then store them out of state someplace. That's one of the big projects is talking about in the Midwest and upper Midwest area. But the process you are talking about is different because you are going to not only capture the emissions, but then use them for another purpose. Did I do okay?
You did more than okay. That's exactly right.
Okay.
Uh, because it's biogenic CO2, if you capture it and use it for another purpose, you have not added any new CO2 to the atmosphere. So, and there are purposes where you need to make things like green fuel replacements for fossil fuel, um, make certain kinds of plastics. You need CO2 to do that. And if you can do it with biogenic CO2, you now have a net zero product, meaning a product that adds no new CO2 to the atmosphere.
Okay. This concept here is still pretty new in the sense that it's challenging for us to go out and look at a bunch of plants and see how they work, right?
Um, well, it's actually pretty simple. Right now, in
Yeah,
fact,
for
the
you, you've
ethanol
got the PhD
world,
here.
well, the, the ethanol world has time after time found a use for something that they used to think of as a waste product.
Sure.
So I've I've been told that back in the day, DDGs would be thrown out and hauled to the dump because who would ever use that?
Hmm.
It's just corn. It's just corn. The leftovers from the fermentation. So the last thing still being thrown out is the CO2. So if we can find a use for that, it reduces the carbon footprint of the ethanol plant, and it also has its own market, so it's something you can sell. It's valuable, and um, it's like, okay, well, that's great. Let's use everything.
Okay, so if I'm an investor in an ethanol plant right now, and I'm intrigued by this, what's the timeline? What's the start to finish timeline before it can be in operation?
Well, we are building our first pilot now,
Hmm.
so that'll demonstrate the process and demonstrate it working at an ethanol plant. Um, Green methanol is an incredibly valuable product. Lots of people want to buy it. We can get into that in a bit. I do want to answer your question. We're probably talking 2 years for a
Okay.
typical ethanol plant to have the facilities to capture all their CO2 and turn it into green methanol, which then can be sold. It's currently selling for $1,200 a metric ton, which is roughly twice the price of methanol that's not green methanol. So it's very high price, very attractive revenue stream. We estimate it will add about $50 million to the bottom line of an average ethanol plant.
And to make this work, you need some kind of power source, right? So
Yes,
that needs to be green as well.
yes, it has to be renewable power. You
Okay.
have done your homework here.
I try.
It has to be renewable power, and that is often a scarce item. So
Hmm.
it's our biggest challenge is to start at the ethanol plants where there's enough renewable power that we can do this cost effectively. And the one good thing we have in our favor for that is um, most of your listeners probably know that renewable power is not something that just runs full speed 24/7. Windmills turn when the wind's blowing. Solar panels, produce electricity in mostly in the middle of the day, but certainly only when the sun's shining. So um, we are happy to use the electricity when no one else wants it. So windmills, as you probably know, get turned off at night often because the grid doesn't need the electricity. So why operate the windmill? We will happily take that electricity at 3 in the morning. And in fact, we've designed our system to be able to run when the power is cheap and easily available, and then you turn it off when it's not.
And you can
So
also go nuclear too if that's available.
that's right. It's there's still argument about whether nuclear is green.
Green or
Nu-
not, sure.
yeah, nuclear is definitely zero carbon, but as you know, there's other controversies around nuclear.
Sure.
So, so our first plant will be all nuclear power, and they again have the problem of they have lots of electricity at night that no one wants to buy. So they're thrilled to have us run our facility, full steam all night, and then turn it down some during the day when there's more demand for that power. And so it makes us very attractive to the renewable energy folks because we can solve one of their problems and expand their marketplace.
And how critical are federal credits to make the math work here?
I like to say that selling the green methanol is the cake. The Inflation Reduction Act tax incentives are the frosting, and carbon credits are the sprinkles on top of the frosting. So,
Okay.
so the IRA tax incentives are great, and obviously investors love that. Um, but they're not at all necessary to the economic viability of the project.
Okay, you kind of teased the uses for green methanol. What are the practical uses of this once it's produced?
The biggest um, sector demanding it right now is maritime shipping. So big ocean going freighters. Um, Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world, has committed that all their ships will be dual fuel by 2030. Um, they are looking for as much green methanol as they can get, and there are most likely sale of the green methanol. And just to give you a sense of the economics, so you could picture it, well, green methanol is more expensive than diesel fuel or the other fuels they use. Why would that be attractive? Who's willing to pay for that? Um, Someone like Adidas, who wants to have net zero shoes. That's sort of on their plans in the near term. It would add 17 cents per pair of shoes to have green Adidas as opposed to regular Adidas. So for them, that's a nothing cost. If they can claim their product's green, they love that. So that will be what drives the green fuel usage in the big ships is consumer goods and companies that want to make sure their products are green.
So what's your tipping point?
Um, I actually think our tipping point is getting the first full-scale plant up and running so the legitimately skeptical people in the ethanol industry go, oh yeah, I guess that is a good idea. Um, I've got a long list of people who've said, I want to see it in operation and then I'm interested. So that's our tipping point.
For the for those looking at, okay, maybe pipeline's the way to go, maybe your way's the way to go. You're not talking about pipeline. So you're not talking about eminent domain challenges, kind of snaking your way through properties and all that kind. What does the physical side of this look like on an existing plant?
It's some new equipment next to the ethanol plant. Typically it's going to be, 10, 20% larger piece of more equipment than already there at the ethanol. So the footprint is very reasonable. Um, there's a couple of reasons why I think we're more attractive than the pipeline. Obviously, you don't need to worry about eminent domain or anything like that. It's a new revenue stream for the ethanol plant. It's not just a cost and maybe some government credits, but it's an actual real revenue stream. It gets you the same carbon footprint reduction. And, it's the pathway to sustainable aviation fuel and future biofuel. It's sort of a key starting point. Eventually, I think many ethanol plants will be very much part of a sustainable aviation fuel supply chain. And this is a step in that direction. So here you go.
What do you say to those who think any of this conversation is kind of wasted and unnecessary? They're not believers that anything needs to be done when it comes to carbon. And if we're seeing extreme weather patterns or differences, things that are changing, perhaps it's some kind of extended cyclical pattern and it will change. So why go through all the expense, the headaches, all this effort?
Well, there's people who think the Earth isn't round. Um, it's science is so overwhelming at this point. It's overwhelming at this point. The weather is extreme. Farming is harder in a number of ways, and I don't think that's just a 5 or 10 year blip. That's that's going to be there's going to be lots of adaptation over the next 50 years, and this is a way to kind of get in on the new markets and the new business that's going to be created from that adaptation. It it I'll tell you a story that sort of encapsulates it. Um, uh, the U.S. under the Biden administration has created these Inflation Reduction Act incentives in many areas, and it has terrified Europe because all the entrepreneurs in Europe that are working on climate technology are moving to the US because it's so much better of a business environment to do it. So there will be a huge business expansion around adapting to climate. And boy, everyone should be, you want to be getting in on that. Yeah, I guess if you were in the software world, you want to be getting in on that. You don't want to kind of poo-poo it while the world's transition. So there's a couple of different answers, but my general feeling about it.
And what about, are there any concerns that what one presidential administration's priority is, the successor may not be, whether we're talking about changes in 2025 or 2029, 30, whatever, down the road?
Sure. So first of all, that's a real problem for the pipeline. There is no business model for the pipeline if you don't have the Inflation Reduction Act incentives. So let's start there. That's that's got to be worrying those people. Second of all, we've really focused on a business where green methanol is going to be valuable, no matter, again, we don't really need the incentives for it to be valuable. And it's a transition strategy for ethanol plants. It's a new business for ethanol plants. And why wouldn't you want to get in on a new business? It's not dependent on the administration.
On this podcast, we have a variety of guests who join us. We talk about a number of different topics, but primarily speaking, on the simplest level, all of our guests have some kind of either personal connection to farmland, whether they grew up on a farm, had relatives who grew up on a farm, maybe ended up working in an industry where they're connected to farmland. Is there some kind of connection personally that you have that makes this whole concept of your new phase, professionally speaking, like what's the connection for you?
Well, the personal connection is Michael McNeil in Algona, Iowa, is one of the fathers of organic and regenerative agriculture. If you look on the USDA maps of organic farms, there's this bright green spot in north central Iowa, and that's him. He created all those, or he coached all those farmers. So he's one of my connections. And Dr. Bob Leonard, a journalist, an Iowa native, and a great guy in general. He's also been a coach. And I've just sort of, I've fallen in love with the ethanol industry in terms of how it was just a reaction to the farm crisis and farmers taking care of themselves and inventing a new way to use their product. That was just, to me, that's perfect. That's America. That's entrepreneurism. And yes, farming is great. And it's farming too, as I've been told. That's the nature of farming. So being a part of that next generation and next set of products and next way of thinking about what they do and how they take care of the land, I'm all in. So that's my connection.
We appreciate the conversation. Thanks for elaborating on this concept. We appreciate it.
You bet. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
He is Dr. Jeff Bonar, CEO of CapCO2 Solutions. You can learn more about him and what he's trying to do by checking out our profile piece about him. You can find that on our weekly newsletter at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. You can sign up while you're there, get that newsletter emailed right to your inbox every week. It's the place where landowners get their news. Thanks for reading that. Thanks for listening here.